Erick chased after his first love abroad. I begged him not to leave, but he didn't even turn his head. A year later, I got married, and Erick flew back. Seeing my wedding ring, the always arrogant Erick finally broke down. He forced a smile and said, "Lara, are you going to take it off yourself, or should I do it for you?" His voice trembled. "If you want a ring, I'll buy you one. Just throw this one away. I beg you." Chapter 1. I didn't invite many people to my wedding, just a small gathering of around a dozen friends and family for a meal. My husband adores me. He didn't let me get tired the whole time, handling the guests himself so I could chat with my best friend. My best friend, Alice, looked at me with a sigh. "I thought you'd wait for Erick forever." I lowered my head and smiled slightly. "I thought so too." She asked, "Does Erick know you got married?" I shook my head. "No, and there's no need for him to know." She paused for a moment and said, "I heard Erick went crazy last night, booked a ticket, and flew back from the US overnight." I didn't respond. He's probably in such a hurry because his first love ran away again, just like before, when she got mad at Erick and ran to the US. Erick booked a flight in front of me, determined to chase after her. At the time, I was on my period, feeling cold even under the blankets. I shivered as I sat in front of him, watching his slender fingers tap his phone without hesitation. Booking a ticket for that same night. I bit my lip, still trying to make him stay. "Erick, can you not go?" Erick looked at me with those dark, shining eyes and smiled nonchalantly. "Be good and stay home. I'll bring you a gift when I come back." He lifted my chin, gave me a light kiss on the lips, and tucked me back under the blanket. "Do you want a necklace or a bracelet?" I didn't say a word. Erick liked giving people jewelry. He had given me so many pieces, but never a ring. He didn't give Zoe many gifts, but every time, it was always a ring. I took a deep breath, gazing at his lean, handsome face, his pale skin, and still, I wanted to ask him to stay. "Can you really not stay?" The smile at the corner of Erick's mouth faded a little. He patted my head. "You know what our relationship is." I froze in place, unable to say anything more. I was the one who chased after Erick. He had only one condition: our relationship couldn't be made public, especially not in front of Zoe. In short, I was just a backup. I had no right to stop him, even though we were already living together. He had even brought me to family gatherings. Seeing that I had stopped talking, Erick smiled and kissed my forehead. "Be good. I'll bring you a gift when I come back." I lowered my head. "When will you be back?" He stood up and slowly buttoned his shirt. "A few days, I guess." At the time, he probably didn't expect that his first love wasn't just taking a break abroad but was going on a study trip, which meant he stayed with her for a year. I watched Erick's tall, upright figure as he left and sighed. Sensing my displeasure, Erick turned around. "Before I leave, think about anything you need me to do for you. I'll do my best to make it happen." I looked at his face and thought for a moment. "Could you help me find someone?" "His name is Paul, a war correspondent." Erick's face darkened. "What's your relationship with him? If you can't explain it, I won't help." I pressed my lips together. "He's my cousin, from my aunt's side." Erick's expression softened, and he nodded. "I'll get back to you." He turned and walked away. I watched his figure disappear, then took a photo out of my wallet. In the photo was a lean, handsome man who looked a lot like Erick. I gently stroked the photo. Erick really is a forgetful person. I had told him before that I grew up in an orphanage. Where would I have an aunt? I also mentioned that there was an older brother in the orphanage who always took care of me, and we grew up together. But he had forgotten all about it, and he never wondered why I liked looking at his face so much. I only loved his face. Chapter 2. Erick truly loves Zoe, even though Zoe has been elusive all these years, refusing to settle down. He still loves her willingly, and I really do love Erick, or rather, his face. That face is so similar to Paul's. I've always been grateful to Erick. He saved me from despair. When I met him, I had already lost track of Paul for 3 years. Many people said Paul was gone. I was a walking corpse, with no life in me, until I saw Erick. A junior who was a year younger than me. When I saw his face, so much like Paul's, I cried. I did everything I could to get close to Erick and treated him unconditionally well. Everyone knew I was Erick's shadow, the one who carried his bag, his coat, bought things for him, relayed messages when he fought with Zoe, and supported him home when he was drunk. I guess I treated him so well, to the point he couldn't ignore it anymore. So, one night after a fight with Zoe, when he was drunk, he pulled me into his arms. "Do you like me?" I looked at that lean, handsome face and nodded. From that day on, I became Erick's secret girlfriend, if a backup counts as a girlfriend, and this went on for years. Even though things didn't work out between Erick and Zoe, the two of us ended up living together. Sometimes Erick would hold me and say, "Lara, you're the best woman for me. You don't even care about my money." I'd laugh. "If you want to give it to me, I won't refuse. But you never spend it." Erick's sharp eyes stared at me. "You don't spend my money. You don't wear the jewelry I buy. And you never pressure me to make our relationship public," he said. "Sometimes I even feel like you're treating me as a backup too." I'd tap his nose and laugh, burying myself in his arms. Whether or not I'm a backup doesn't matter. We're not made of stone. We've been together for 6 years. Those 6 years meant a lot to me, but Erick doesn't think the same. Erick still loves Zoe. If Zoe calls him drunk late at night, he'll immediately get dressed and go pick her up. In the past, Erick would just leave without ever explaining to me. But later, Erick started to explain himself, and there was guilt on his face. I thought it meant that I had started to mean something different to him. But I was wrong. He still chased after Zoe abroad, not giving me any chance to make him stay. And he stayed away for a year. Chapter 3. Erick actually came back once during that time. He was drunk and asked me to pick him up. When I got there, he was sitting in a private room at a nightclub, video calling Zoe. When he saw me, he waved me over. "Lara, come here." He showed Zoe. "Let me introduce you. This is my girlfriend of 6 years, Lara." Zoe remained indifferent, but her eyes scanned me, lingering on my face for a few seconds. Then she smiled. "Erick, have you fallen out of love?" Erick also smiled. "Yeah, why should I keep chasing after someone cold when I have a gentle, caring wife right here?" Zoe looked at Erick, who was holding me, and asked how long we had been together. I answered honestly, 6 years. Zoe hung up the call. The always proud Zoe, for the first time, lost her composure. She didn't even say goodbye. Erick's arm around me suddenly stiffened. That night, Erick was holding me while we slept. In the middle of the night, he took a call, and after returning, he started kissing me constantly. He didn't sleep the whole night, just kept watching me. By morning, his voice was hoarse. "Lara, this is the end for us." I hadn't slept all night either. I had already guessed it. I overheard Erick's call. Zoe casually told him to break up with me, saying if he did, she'd be with him right away. I knew I wasn't as important as Zoe. I nodded, not wanting to make things too ugly, and turned away to wipe my eyes. Erick hugged me from behind so tightly that I could hardly breathe. He whispered in my ear, "Your aunt's son. I found him. He's not dead. Just lost his memory and is abroad." I froze completely. I turned around. "Can you help bring him back?" Erick kissed my lips one last time. "I can. I owe you that." The same day, he flew out to be with Zoe, and a few days later, I saw Paul. He was in the best hospital, with the best doctors treating him. Soon, his memory returned, and he remembered me. Paul had been injured and lost his memory while saving a child in a war zone. When he woke up, the first thing he did was hold me. His gentle voice echoed in my ear. "I'm sorry I wasn't here for the last 10 years. You've suffered." My tears flowed instantly. The emptiness in my heart was silently filled at that moment. Chapter 4. Paul and I had already missed 10 years, and neither of us wanted to waste another 10. We got engaged quickly. Paul asked me if I had fallen in love with anyone else during those 10 years, urging me not to make a rash decision that I'd regret. A blurry image of Erick's face flashed through my mind, but it disappeared just as quickly. I shook my head and smiled. "No, I traced the scars on Paul's body left from saving the child in the war zone and repeated, "No, the truth is, before Paul asked me, I had a few dreams, and Erick appeared in them. In the dreams, Erick sneered at me, telling me not to be so delusional. It still made my heart ache, but as time passed, I stopped dreaming about Erick. Those 6 years seemed to have blown away with the wind. Sometimes, my best friend Alice would ask if I ever thought of Erick. I stayed silent for a few seconds and shook my head. I hope he and Zoe are doing well together. I said, it's better if we forget each other. At least, I had seriously left him behind in the past. But a few days later, while Paul and I were having dinner, we ran into one of Erick's classmates. From a distance, he greeted us enthusiastically. "Why didn't you call when you came back?" After taking a few steps, he stopped in his tracks, looking shocked. Paul and Erick look very alike, but Paul has a scar on his forehead from the war zone. Their temperaments are entirely different too. Paul lacks that careless, spoiled air that Erick had. Instead, he carries a steady, more hardened demeanor. The classmate stared at Paul, then at me with confusion. "Lara, is this?" He hesitated, then asked, "Did you cheat on Erick?" I shook my head. "We broke up." The classmate looked even more surprised. "But Erick said you were still waiting for him." I interrupted him. "This is my fiancé. We're getting married soon." He was stunned, watching Paul and me holding hands tightly. He turned and hurried off, making a phone call as he walked. I looked up to explain to Paul, but just as I started, Paul smiled. "It's all in the past. No need to talk about it." He gently brushed my hair aside. "I can't expect you to wait for me for 10 years just because I disappeared for 10. My eyes started to burn, and suddenly, I felt a wave of sadness. In those first 3 years when I couldn't find Paul, I waited by my phone every single day. I kept it on 24 hours a day, and every time an unknown number called, my heart would race. In the first year, I hoped I'd get a call saying Paul was just injured and would be home soon. In the second year, I just hoped someone would tell me Paul was still alive. By the third year, I was afraid to answer the phone, yet I couldn't help but pick it up. When Erick appeared, I had already been diagnosed with severe anxiety and panic disorder. His face was my last lifeline. Being a backup for Erick wasn't without its grievances, but I couldn't tear myself away from that face. Only by looking at him could I find the strength to keep going. So, do I love Erick? I don't know, but I am grateful to him, grateful enough to let everyone mock me as a backup. And still, I accepted it willingly. In these 6 years, Erick was a good person to me, the one who saved me from despair. I thought I'd left a decent impression on him too. At the very least, I thought he'd see me as someone sensible, but I never expected him to grit his teeth and call me a liar. Chapter 5. Erick called me in the middle of the night. I gently got out of bed, not wanting to wake Paul. I thought he wanted to collect some things he'd left with me, but as soon as I answered, he spoke viciously, as if he wanted to tear me apart, gritting his teeth as he spat out 2 words. "Liar." His voice was hoarse and low. "Lara, you're a liar. You said he was your aunt's child. You lied to me." He no longer had that carefree, arrogant attitude. He was holding back his anger, and there was even a hint of sadness in his voice, like a child's sadness. I lowered my head and sighed. "I'm sorry." I apologized easily, as I had for the past 6 years. There had been many reasons to apologize, like when I stared at him too long in front of Zoe, making her upset, or when I tried to hold his hand in front of Zoe's friends, or when I called him during his dinners with Zoe. Each time, I would apologize, look at that face, and obediently say, "I'm sorry." Erick used to hesitantly pat my head like I was a child, saying, "Just change it next time." Later, he would rest his chin in his hand, smiling as he said, "You're so obedient when you apologize." Eventually, he stopped setting so many rules for me, but my instinct to apologize hadn't changed, and I blurted out, "I'm sorry." Erick paused for a moment, then gritted his teeth. "This time, an apology won't cut it." "Lara, I'm really angry. I should have just left your lover in the war zone for the rest of his life. Why did I go out of my way just to put a green hat on my head?" My face turned cold, But he didn't notice and kept pressing me. Did he touch you? Lara, answer me. Did he touch you? I interrupted his impatient voice. Erick, stop talking about him like that. He's very important to me. Suddenly, there was silence on the other end. After a moment, I heard something smash. Erick, gritting his teeth, let out a bitter laugh. Word by word. Lara, you never told me I was important to you. He added, remember, as long as I haven't told you to leave, you're still mine. I'm not yours. I frowned and corrected him. From the moment you left for the US to find Zoe, we were over. Erick was silent for a moment before softly asking, so this is your revenge on me, right? He seemed more certain. You're with him to get back at me, aren't you? If I gave you a chance to regret. I frowned even more. Erick, stop. You and Zoe are finally together. Just make the most of it. Erick didn't respond. His breathing was heavy and quick. After a while, he hung up without saying a word. Listening to the busy tone, I sighed. Erick hadn't changed. As soon as Zoe was mentioned, his rationality returned. In the past, he would call me in the middle of the night after drinking too much, asking me to pick him up. I'd rush out in my pajamas with a coat over them and find him drunk outside the bar. In the freezing weather, my hands were numb from the cold, but he refused to go home. His friend, helpless, apologized to me and then video called Zoe. Let's show Zoe what a mess you are. Suddenly, Erick stood up straight, as if he had never been drunk, opened the car door himself, and got in. I stood outside with his friend, exchanging awkward glances. His friend's eyes were filled with awkwardness and sympathy. I'm sorry. I can't help it. Zoe's the only one who can make him listen. I shook my head. It's okay. I don't mind. That day, I stayed up all night making hangover soup for Erick and taking care of him, and he held me while calling out for Zoe all night long. A voice inside me kept asking, Lara, do you really not mind? Then why are your hands and feet so cold? I sighed and forced myself to pull away from the memories, not wanting to think about it anymore. I looked toward the bedroom. Inside was the man I loved most. What happened in the past doesn't matter. What matters is the present. And now, I no longer care. Chapter 6. Paul and I started preparing for the wedding. I went to try on wedding dresses, ignoring several of Erick's calls, but my phone kept buzzing nonstop. They were all WeChat messages from Erick. He hadn't sent me this many messages in a month before. Lara, I haven't told you to leave yet. Lara, you're going to regret this. What are you doing? Reply. You never used to take this long to answer. Annoyed by the constant buzzing, I grabbed my phone in the dressing room and quickly replied, I'm trying on wedding dresses. Stop messaging me. The phone went silent for a moment. Then it started buzzing wildly again, non-stop, as if the person on the other end had gone mad. I couldn't take it anymore and answered, Erick, if you keep acting like this, we can't even be friends. He ignored me, bombarding me with questions. What's so great about him? Lara, marriage and love are two different things. He took a deep breath. Lara, be reasonable. Did your parents agree to this wedding? Why don't you wait for me to come back and talk to them? I calmly interrupted him. Erick, stop it. There was silence on the other end. I spoke quietly. Erick, I'm really getting married. He and I grew up together. We know each other well, and we love each other. Erick tried to say something, but I cut him off again. You're going to make Zoe upset if you keep this up. He didn't say anything, but I could hear his breathing becoming more uneven. I sighed. I've told you before, I grew up in an orphanage. Where would I have parents? Why do you always forget? Then I hung up. Erick didn't call back. Meanwhile, Paul had been patiently waiting outside the dressing room, never asking why I had taken so long. When I came out, Paul hugged me for a long time, unwilling to let go. Lara, thank you for loving me. I hugged him back. Thank you too. We both grew up in an orphanage. From a young age, any bit of kindness we received had to be remembered and cherished deeply. Unlike Erick, the rich young master who always got whatever he wanted. Now, His once obedient ex-girlfriend was suddenly getting married without a hitch. It's no wonder he's losing it. But I believe time heals everything. Eventually, he'll let go of his resentment and move on. Chapter 7. But I overestimated Erick's ability to accept things. A few days later, as I was preparing for the wedding and making sure to get my beauty sleep every day, Erick called again in the middle of the night. It sounded like he had been drinking. "Lara, you've really done well." I was growing very impatient, already considering blocking him. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse and low. "Back then, why didn't I think to take a look at the picture? If I had just looked once, I would have known something was off." He sounded both aggrieved and furious, but I didn't even glance at it. "I pulled him out of the war zone, healed him, and brought him to you. Why the hell didn't I think to look at the photo earlier? I've put a green hat on my own head." Erick was so angry his voice was trembling. He lowered his voice, clearly trying to control his emotions, but still couldn't stop it from shaking. "Lara, did you treat me as a substitute?" I remained silent. He was silent too. After a moment, he gritted his teeth and yelled in a low voice, "Say something! Why aren't you talking?" But suddenly, my mind drifted back to the past, when Zoe had another suitor. Erick posted a picture of my back on his social media. I was wearing the latest luxury dress Zoe had wanted for that season. It was the only time I ever wore something Erick bought me. Usually, I wouldn't even take the tags off and would just hang them in the closet. But that day, Erick insisted I wear the dress and took a picture of me. It was the first time he had posted me on social media. A lot of people liked the post, and many were asking who I was in the comments. Erick wrapped his arm around me and showed me the post, casually calling me wifey. "They're all asking about you." When Erick was in a good mood, he'd call me wifey. He twisted a strand of my hair around his finger. "I told them you're my wife. My friends are so jealous." I smiled, but my eyes caught a new comment from Zoe. "I want to go to a music festival. Want to come?" A while later, Erick glanced at his phone. His hand paused for a moment. Then he turned the phone over, acting as if nothing had happened, pulled out his credit card, and said, "Go buy yourself some bags." Then he stood up, put on his jacket, and left. I watched his figure as he walked out, and for some reason, I suddenly called out to him, "Erick, can you not go?" Erick held the doorknob, hesitated for a moment, then turned around and smiled. "Feeling lonely? Just take your time shopping, buy a few more outfits, and get some jewelry." He turned back and closed the door. Just as it was about to shut completely, he added, "I'll be back soon, wifey." I watched as the door slowly closed and lowered my head, unsure how I felt. By then, we had gone from university to the working world. Erick had stopped calling me baby and started calling me wifey. In some ways, I felt differently about him. I stared at the credit card on the coffee table for a long time, then put it in a drawer, never touching it again, and I never let my feelings stir again either. A few days later, Erick came back. The social media post with my picture had disappeared at some point. When a friend called to ask him why he deleted his girlfriend's picture, he casually replied, "Oh, just a girl I saw on the street, though she looked nice. I took a picture, didn't want you guys to misunderstand, so I deleted it." At the time, I was in his arms, motionless, quiet, and gentle. He hung up the phone and kissed my ear. "You're so good, wifey." After thinking for a moment, he reposted my picture but made it visible to only himself. Erick stroked my hair. "You're too pretty, wifey. No need for others to see." I looked at his face, smiled, and said nothing, feeling nothing inside, just like that credit card locked away in the drawer. At the time, I never complained, accepting things quietly, knowing how it felt inside. But now, Erick was full of resentment. "Lara, say something. Am I just a substitute?" I sighed, deciding to lay it all out. "And what about me, Erick? What do these 6 years mean to me?" Erick froze. I continued, "For 6 years, I never complained in front of you. Erick, it's only been a few days, and you already can't handle it?" Erick's breathing became erratic. I sighed again, ended the call, and blocked Erick's WeChat and phone number. Finally, I said goodbye to those 6 years completely. Chapter 8. Paul and I got our marriage license and held the wedding banquet. All in one go. I meticulously planned everything, picked out the perfect wedding dress, and gave myself a fairy tale wedding. From now on, I would no longer be alone. I had my own home and family. But at the wedding, my best friend Alice told me that Erick had booked a flight in the middle of the night and was rushing back in a frenzy. I didn't really believe her. After all, he and Zoe had finally gotten together. He wouldn't be so impulsive as to leave Zoe behind and fly back. But what I never expected was that he would actually show up. The Erick I remembered was tall, handsome, and full of elegance. But now, Erick looked pale, haggard, holding a jewelry box, and quietly watching Paul and me. Or rather, he seemed to be looking at Paul more than me. He startled me. Erick glanced at Paul, then at me, and beckoned me with his finger. Paul had just gone to greet some colleagues. So I, fearing Erick would cause a scene, rushed over to him and softly pleaded, "Please don't make a fuss. This wedding is too important to me. I don't want anything to go wrong." Erick's face darkened. Though I was begging him, it seemed to only make him angrier. He looked at Paul in the distance. "Lara, between the two of us, who looks more like the substitute?" I froze, not quite understanding what he meant. Erick asked again, "Wifey, between him and me, who looks more like the stand-in?" He called me wifey so naturally, as if we were still together, but he only called me wifey when he was in a good mood, and his good mood always had something to do with Zoe. I'd rather he just called me Lara. Using my full name, I frowned and replied coldly, "Erick, I'm not your wife." I pointed at Paul. "I'm his wife, and we've got the papers to prove it." Erick stared at me, saying nothing, his face turning livid. I started to regret speaking to him like that. He was born into privilege, and being confronted like this might just trigger him to act out in some reckless way. I stood there frozen, trying to figure out how to get rid of him without causing a scene. When I heard Paul calling for me, my heart was filled with anxiety, but I didn't dare show it. All I could think about was Erick's cold expression and the uncertainty hanging over my wedding. Paul, seemingly unaware of anything wrong, wrapped his arms around me, gently calming my nerves. "Don't run off. I might lose you." He patted my shoulder. "Don't worry. I'm here," leaning against Paul's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. My anxiety vanished. I smiled and nodded. "Okay." Paul lowered his head and gave me a light kiss on the lips, and I wrapped my arms around him, kissing him back. As long as Paul was there, it didn't matter if the wedding went perfectly or not. With Paul by my side, I feared nothing. I kissed him deeply and passionately. When the kiss ended, I realized Erick was gone. There was no scene like I had imagined. He had quietly left. Alice told me Erick had hurried away, as if he was running from some wild beast. Then my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "You never smiled at me like that." Alice was still beside me, gesturing. Erick looked like he'd been rattled. I've never seen him so disheveled. He even stumbled a bit. "What's going on with the young master?" I shook my head, not saying anything, holding Paul's hand, not wanting to let go. We had relied on each other since childhood, loved each other in our youth, and now we were finally together. What happened to anyone else didn't matter. What mattered was that I was with the person I loved. Chapter 9. Before Erick left, he asked Alice to give me a ring. Alice scoffed. Now he knows how to buy a ring? Where was he back then? Alice never really liked Erick. She always thought I deserved better and hated that I stayed with him. But she couldn't do much about it. Erick had always been generous with me. Necklaces, bracelets, earrings, brooches. All different, but never a ring. One time at dinner, Alice joked and asked Erick when he would give me a ring. Erick made a call, and shortly after, a driver arrived with a jade necklace for me. Alice was so angry her hands shook. "I said a ring. After all these years, doesn't Lara deserve a ring?" Erick rested his arm on the back of my chair, his body language making it clear he thought he had me in his grasp. He crossed his legs, smiling casually. "She'll get one eventually. Why are you in such a rush?" He tilted my chin up and smiled at me, promising, "Within 10 years, I'll put a ring on your finger." I smiled faintly, not saying a word. Suddenly, I missed Paul. Paul wouldn't joke around with promises like that, even if they looked alike. They weren't the same person, and they never would be. After that dinner, I wanted to distance myself from Erick. I stopped answering his calls, ignored his messages, changed the lock code on my door, and never went to see him again. A few days later, Erick's stomach issues flared up again, and he sent me a video. His face was pale and haggard. Suddenly, I thought of Paul before he went missing in the war zone. Wasn't he also this exhausted? I couldn't control myself. Despite Alice's disapproving look, I went to see Erick. Erick's house was littered with empty bottles. I didn't know how much he had drunk in the week I had been avoiding him. Sighing, I cleaned up his place, made porridge, did his laundry, peeled apples, and took care of him until he got better. Erick held my hand tightly. "Don't hide from me, Lara. I'm not lying. I'll really buy you a ring within 10 years. He gestured with his hand, a diamond this big. I laughed. "Then why not now?" Erick fell silent. After a while, he quietly said, "I have something I need to resolve first." He pulled me into his arms, making me lie down with him, and I could hear his rapid heartbeat. "Lara, I'm not lying. Just wait for me. 10 years. I looked at his face and didn't say anything. Erick held me tighter, as if afraid I would run away. "It's a promise, 10 years. I rested my face on his solid chest, listening to his heartbeat. A heartbeat never lies. Chapter 10. 10 years later, on our wedding night, Paul and I barely slept. Early the next morning, while Paul was still asleep, I blushed as I went downstairs to throw away the used condoms. As soon as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw Erick. He was standing beside a Ferrari, his jaw covered in stubble, his eyes bloodshot, and cigarette butts scattered around his feet. I had no idea how much he had smoked. He glanced at the trash bag in my hand, then quickly looked away, forcing himself not to look again. His voice was hoarse beyond belief. "Lara, I waited all night, watching as your lights went out." His usual pride was completely gone. He avoided looking at the trash bag but couldn't avoid seeing the red mark on my neck. Erick, staring at my neck like he had lost his most cherished treasure. His eyes began to redden. His voice, filled with despair, cracked. "Lara, I'm sick. I don't feel well." In the past, when he said that, I would drop everything and rush to take care of him. I would cook for him, peel apples, feed him medicine, and take his temperature. But now, all I could say was, "Take some medicine." Erick's body swayed slightly, and his eyes reddened even more. Erick's family had always been wealthy, and fearing he might be kidnapped, they had sent him to learn martial arts from a young age. He had grown up tough, through falls and bruises, never coddled. His biggest pride was being the only son of a rich family but never being pampered. But now, a single tear fell from his eye, and he didn't even wipe it away. He just stood there, looking at me. Erick closed his eyes for a moment and gritted his teeth, as if he were about to say something difficult. "Even if I'm just a substitute, can't a substitute become the real thing? Lara, I can't accept seeing you with someone else." I was speechless for a moment and shook my right hand. There was a wedding ring on my finger. The diamond wasn't big, but it was one I had carefully designed and custom-made. Erick's face turned even paler. "Lara, take it off. Are you going to do it? Or should I?" His voice was hoarse as he begged me. "If you want a ring, I'll buy you one, as big as you want. Just throw that one away. I'm begging you." I shook my head. "No, Erick, I can't do that. This is my wedding ring." I looked down at the ring. "Paul bought it for me. I love it." Erick choked up. "Don't say that, Lara. It hurts. It really hurts." I sighed. I didn't have any resentment toward Erick. After all, it was that face that helped me through the hardest times. I also hoped Erick would let go of the past and move on. I was about to offer him some comforting words, but when I looked up, I saw someone who shocked me. Zoe had arrived. She, who was always so polished and beautiful, looked awful. She stared at me in disbelief, then at Erick. "Erick, People told me, but I didn't believe it. You broke up with me in the middle of the night, booked a flight home. Was it really for her? She glanced at my wedding ring, looking humiliated. She's so plain, and she's already married. You broke up with me? Zoe looked furious. In the past, one angry word from Zoe would send Erick halfway across the world to chase after her. But now, he didn't even turn his head, acting as if she wasn't even there, and kept talking to me. Lara, I really can't live without you. I can't sleep. I haven't slept properly in days. He looked utterly worn out. Come back, please. Lara, wifey. I'll change everything. I won't look at another woman ever again. His voice was so hoarse it was barely recognizable. A substitute can become the real thing. Marriage can end in divorce. I swear. I'll change, please. I'm begging you. I opened my mouth but was too stunned to speak. I had never seen Erick like this. Never. Erick, even with all the back and forth with Zoe over the years, had never begged her like this. Zoe was stunned too. Her face turned red, then white, and finally, she threw out, "Don't regret this. I won't give you a second chance." Before turning and running off in tears, Erick didn't even turn his head. I reminded him, "Zoe's really gone," but Erick reached out to pull me closer. I never intended to stay with her long term. She was just an obsession. When it comes to marriage, the only person in my mind is you, Erick. I massaged my temples, cutting him off. I was worried Paul would wake up and not find me, so I decided to lay everything out. The truth is, I didn't always see you as a substitute. There were moments when I had feelings for you. How could I not? 6 years of intimacy, of being so close, how could I not feel something? Erick's eyes brightened. I sighed. But you were the one who pushed me away. Erick, don't you remember? Every time I started to feel something for you, you chose Zoe. I gave him a bitter smile. You were the one who pushed me away. You kept reminding me that Paul would never treat me that way, and that you could never replace him. The light in Erick's eyes dimmed. Still, he struggled to say, "I can change, Lara. I can." I shook my head, interrupting him. Erick, you don't love me. You just can't accept that someone doesn't love you. Before, it was Zoe. Now, it's me. I pointed to my chest. But I can't keep going in circles with you. My heart belongs to my husband now, and there's no room left for you. The last glimmer of hope in Erick's eyes faded completely. I didn't say anything more, just walked past him and headed home. When I reached the door, I suddenly saw Paul standing there quietly. I didn't know how long he had been awake. I panicked. You heard everything. Paul reached out and pulled me into his arms. Don't worry. He patted my back. Erick called me, told me about the two of you, and asked me to let you go. What did you say? I asked, looking up at him in surprise. I paid him back double for the money he spent getting me back and treated, and I sent him a wedding invitation while I was at it. What? I was speechless. That's how Erick found out about our wedding location. Paul really knows how to cut deep. Chapter 11. I don't know when Erick left. I didn't have the time to care. I was busy preparing for my honeymoon with Paul. On a sunny afternoon, Paul and I arrived at an island for our honeymoon. Blue skies, white clouds, crystal clear sea, and golden sands. A gentle breeze blew as Paul and I relaxed, basking in the sunlight by the beach. We stayed there until the evening when we returned to the beachside cabin. I had mentioned this cabin to Erick years ago, telling him I wanted to stay here, but we never had the time. Later, when Paul heard me mention it, he immediately booked the cabin and decided to bring me here for our honeymoon. I stood by the window, wanting to admire the nighttime ocean, but then I noticed a familiar figure sitting in front of the cabin next door, drinking beer on the beach. He was all alone, surrounded by empty bottles. I bit my lip and closed the window. Just as I was about to draw the curtains, Paul came over, embraced me, and kissed me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Erick's lonely figure on the beach, constantly tilting his head back to drink. And then Paul carried me to the bedroom. In the early morning, I got up for some water. Glancing outside, I was surprised to see Erick still on the beach, unmoving, alarmed. I rushed out and knelt down to check if he was still breathing. Thankfully, he was. I patted my chest in relief and was about to leave when Erick suddenly grabbed my hand and opened his eyes. Those once spirited eyes were now bleary with drunkenness, filled with sadness and helplessness. Gazing at me quietly in the morning sunlight, in a hoarse voice, he pleaded, "Lara, can I hug you one more time? Just one hug, just one." I shook my head, pulled my hand away, and stood up. "I'm married, Erick." Erick was very drunk, half crying and half laughing, his voice blending with the sound of the rising tides. "But I can't let you go, Lara. It's not about wanting what I can't have. It's about not realizing I loved you. Lara, wifey, please, give me one more chance, will you? I'll never take you for granted again." I paused in my steps, then walked back. This constant back and forth wouldn't solve anything. I might as well make him give up for good. When I walked back, it seemed to give Erick hope. He looked at me with expectation in his eyes, but I lowered my head, pulled out my phone, and silently showed him a picture. It was a photo of a pregnancy test, with 2 lines. "I'm pregnant, Erick." Erick froze. After a few seconds, he forcefully pushed the phone away, as if pushing away a venomous snake, refusing to look at it again. He couldn't say a word. I stood up and looked down at him, returning the words he had once said to me when we broke up. Word for word, "We're done." With that, I walked back to the cabin. Behind me, there was only dead silence. Chapter 12. Later. I completely forgot about Erick. Paul and I lived a lively, happy life, leaving the past behind. 10 months later, I was pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl. At our daughter's 100-day celebration, Paul proudly carried her around, showing her off to everyone with an uncontainable smile. I sat off to the side, watching Paul and our daughter, feeling warm inside. A server from the banquet hall approached me, handing over a beautifully wrapped gift box. "Ma'am, a gentleman asked me to deliver this to you," thinking it was a gift from one of Paul's friends. I thanked the server and opened the box. Inside were 2 items. One was a shiny golden lock. The other was a huge diamond ring. The ring looked very familiar to me. Alice came over to take a look and gasped, "Isn't this the ring Erick gave you for your wedding? The one he asked me to give you, but you refused, so I returned it to him?" I froze, unsure what to say. After a moment, I gathered myself and rushed out with the gift box. But I was too late. I saw Erick's tall, slender figure getting into a familiar sports car, and the engine roared as he drove away. Alice followed me outside and sighed. "If he had been like this earlier, you too might have." I shook my head and smiled. "What are you talking about? There's no such thing as what if. A missed chance is a missed chance. There's no what if, and no remedy for regrets." I returned to the banquet hall, looking at my husband and daughter, feeling more grateful than ever. Paul came over, holding me and asking, "Is there something on my face? You keep staring at me." I shook my head and leaned into his embrace. "I'm just grateful that I didn't miss out on you. I didn't miss out on my true happiness."